this evening we have a very exciting guest speaker. I think it's been very popular at school as well, the work that Achim Menges is doing. And at the moment he's founder and director of the Institute for Computational Design in Stuttgart, and also a visiting professor at Harvard USD and AA Emerging Technologies Department. So Achim's work is, I think it's familiar to everyone, and I myself been following it maybe from the beginnings, and it's always very exciting because it's one of the rare examples that we can see where it really pushes a very high articulation, architectural design aspects, but at the same time it's extremely rigorous and serious about research into performance, structure, engineering, and it's also very, it's managing to be very cross-disciplinary as well, and involve other disciplines such as biomimetic scientists and engineers, mathematicians, computer scientists. So it's, although lots of professionals at the moment is talking and attempting to open this field that architecture is, I think this is one of the rare examples when we see really exciting developments and results coming of such a way of working. You all know probably a series of amazing pavilions that Achim did in Stuttgart in the past 3 years, so I really look forward to see them this evening. It's also important to mention that Achim is a very prolific thinker as well, and he published maybe something like over 80 papers and published 8 books on the research and work, so it's very exciting to see.
On the control panel there, just to the left.
Thank you. So, thanks for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. I think it's Halloween tonight, isn't it? It's amazing that you still managed to get here. Anyways, what I want to do in this lecture is basically do 2 things. First, I would like to introduce a little bit sort of the underlying conceptual theoretical framework of our design research that has been sort of mentioned by Lisa in the introduction. And then I want to show a number of projects, but I chose not to actually show kind of many of them, but just 4, and sort of elaborate on them in a bit more detail so that you get an understanding of what's involved with conducting this kind of design research. So at the beginning, I think it's important to realize, though, that computation, and that's what is alluded to in the name of the institute, in its most basic meaning actually refers to the processing of information. So in this way, both machine processes that operate in the binary realm of the digital, as well as material processes that operate in the even more complex domain of the physical, can actually be considered computation. So I think we all know that there's quite a strong bias towards machine computation in contemporary design. I think there's still very interesting sporadic investigations of material computation in architecture, and I will show a couple of them later on. What has been really quite rarely explored is the territory in between where these kind of 2 fields potentially overlap, where they're not just sort of coexist next to each other, but where they intensely interact in the design process. And I think that's somehow the research that we are trying to conduct. So operating at this overlap of these 2 fields in many ways entails integrating material information, and that is actually behaviors originating in the materiality of constraints emanating from materialization within the computation design process. So it really suggests a conception of material not so much as a passive receptor of shape, as is quite emblematic, I would argue, for a contemporary digital design approach, but more as a kind of active generator form, which may find its conceptual roots in the process of becoming nature. And that's what we usually refer to as morphogenesis. So as you may all remember from your biology classes, natural morphogenesis is actually the process of individual growth and evolutionary development that derives the complex organization, structure, and shape of natural systems from two things. On the one hand, the interaction of the system, intrinsic material capacities, and on the other, the kind of external influences and forces that act upon the system. So the resulting astounding functional integration and performative capacity emerges through what we call the process of morphological differentiation, which is actually the summary process of each element's highly specific response and adaptation to its environment. One other really striking aspect of natural morphogenesis is that here, formation and naturalization is always and absolutely inseparably related. So that may initially sound very obvious, but it's still a very stark contrast to the kind of way we consider architecture as a material practice, which is still characterized by a hierarchical relationship that prioritizes the definition of form, structure, and space over its subsequent naturalization. I think one can say that since the Renaissance, the rising separation between the processes of design and making has led to a conception of materialization as something that is rather facilitative and not very generative, and materiality as something that is more a kind of passive property of form rather than an active generator of design. And I think I would argue that this is still very much the case today, maybe especially in what we call digital design. So in many ways, over the last 10 years, the focus of my practice and research at various institutions has been the development of a quite different approach to design computation, one in which materialization and computation is intrinsically intertwined. And I think one can actually trace quite an interesting history of such an approach to probably some of the most radical and influential academic ventures of the 20th century, in this case actually Germany. So on the one hand, Joseph Alber's material studies at the Bauhaus in Dessau may establish a kind of precedent for the possible enrichment of design processes through what he called actually material experimentation. It's interesting to note that Albers actually rejected established processes of materialization based on professional craft knowledge, claiming that they stiffly mentioned. Instead, he identified the material behavior itself as a creative domain for developing new modes of construction and innovation. And these material studies were really conceived not as scalar models or representation of ideas, but really as temporary unfoldings of material behavior in space and time. So on the other hand, and probably at the other end of the spectrum of a kind of material-oriented design approach, by Otto's extensive series of experiments at the institute, at his institute at the University of Stuttgart, may be mentioned, where he studied actually what he called form-finding methods that were actually a range of studies in which he investigated how physical computing can be employed to find a highly specific form, most prominently probably with his so-called studies from which he actually used the kind of construction methods for a lot of catch and active structures. So this is really a kind of example of employing physical computing. So within the contemporary context of design computation, I quite like to think about our approach or our kind of research as a possible extension and synthesis of both sort of Alber's experimental approach of employing material as a driving force in the creative process and Otto's scientific rigor in conducting architectural inquiry. So basically what I will present today are 4 fields of design research and related projects focusing on materiality, materialization, material structure, and finally material performance, which may allow to think of a more kind of exploratory design culture, integrative material practice of architecture. So the first chapter will really focus on materiality with the aim of showing how an approach to design computation allows to understand material not as a passive receptor of preconceived form, but as a kind of generative driver in the design process. And in order to show kind of how such an approach allows exploring new facets of even quite mundane building materials, I will focus a part of the presentation actually on wood, which is actually one of the oldest and most common materials we have, but it's still interesting. It can be sort of rejected as almost a new lease of life with these kind of processes. However, it's very important to understand that we are not a kind of wood building institute, and we are by no means limited to these kind of investigations. We have worked on a wide range of other materials, for example, composites, for which we have developed design tools for exploring the particular behavior of what is called 3D warp meter textiles, which led to the design and production of a series of monoblock lounge furnitures that are all based on the specific behavior of these spacer textiles that actually form the core of these systems, which also further explore the design of more complex composite shell constructions, such as these media stations for a library in Norway, and ultimately also in sort of self-forming composite surfaces that have a kind of secondary skin articulation that enhances their performative capacity. Over many years by now, we've also investigated membrane structures and tensile structures, most recently through doctoral research of Sean Orquist at my institute, who is actually investigating spatial membrane systems and is also developing quite a sophisticated software environment for the design and production of complex tension-active structures, which he tests continuously through large-scale prototypes, and more recently has also explored the possibility of actually integrating sort of bending active carbon fiber frames into these membrane systems, which actually allows achieving self-supporting structures that are not hung on a kind of external frame, and that can be further enhanced by additional layers of CNC-produced secondary textile articulation. Another example, and that's probably situated at the very sort of other end of the spectrum of material systems that we investigate, is the research on aggregate structures that is currently undertaken by Carola Iris, who investigates how the behavior of granular substances with designed macroparticles can actually be explored through a combination of material and machine compilation. What is really interesting about the physics and material behavior of such aggregates, such sort of designed granular substances, is that they combine the stable character of a solid material and the smooth adaptability of a fluid, suggesting that the emergent spatial structures can not only be sort of functionally graded, but also rapidly reconfigured. So I think all these kind of systems are quite interesting, but as I mentioned, I will sort of focus this presentation a little bit on wood, which obviously begs the question why one would actually sort of relate a fairly innovative computational design approach to what initially seems quite an archaic building material. I think in order to explain that, it's important that in the light of the kind of environmental challenges the built environment is facing, it's actually increasingly recognized that there are hardly any other materials that can rival wood's environmental virtues. And it really is a naturally renewable, a kind of material that holds a very low level of embodied energy and has a positive carbon footprint. However, and it's important to realize that, in contrast to most other construction materials that are actually specifically designed for the needs of the building sector, wood, obviously, as we all know, grows as the functional tissue of trees, which results in a very differentiated fibrous cellular structure. And somehow the design opportunities that are innate in this very heterogeneous makeup of wood are usually completely neglected in today's construction practice. And wood is really dumbed down to just another dimensional building element, for which probably the naming conventions in the US is most problematic, where these things are just called 2x2, 2x4, and don't even refer to it as a piece of wood anymore. In contrast to this, I think that computation processes really allow for a kind of renewed appreciation of the amazing differentiation and surprising behavioral capacities that are inherent in wood's complex anatomy. Thus, and I think that's important to realize, is that all these research projects that I will present, or most of them, had their beginning in investigation that starts on the microscopic level. So literally investigating the microstructure of wood. And when you do this, you can actually identify that wood can be described as a natural fiber composite system. Because in the various layers of wood, or all of the wood cells, the cellulosic microfibrils function actually like fibers that are reinforced by a matrix of lignin or end-hemicellulose in which they are embedded. And as such, as a kind of naturally grown fiber composite material, wood shares actually a number of properties with synthetic composites, such as, for example, glass fiber reinforced plastics that are characterized by relatively low stiffness combined with relatively high structural capacity. That in other terms means that you can actually bend them a lot and they still have a high structural performance, as you may know from pole vaulting, for example, where the pole is actually bent dramatically and can still lift the vaulter across the bar. So it's interesting that these particular material properties and behaviors are especially well suited for construction techniques that employ the elasticity of wood to form complex lightweight structures from initially very simple planar building elements. And in many ways, this was exactly the aim of the first research project I want to show in a little bit more detail, which really investigated how one can use the material behavior as the active driver in the design process. And this is actually something I should mention as a kind of collaborative undertaking of my institute and the Institute of Jan Knippers, who is a kind of institute that focuses on structural engineering. So at the core of this project is very much the awareness that any material has the ability to compute form. And a good example, and this is the one you can see here, is the very specific figure that a strip of plywood finds once it's actually exposed to a force at one of its support points. So you don't do anything else than sort of pull on one of the supports and you get this kind of parabolic shape of the plywood strip more or less for free. And despite the fact that this sort of elastic material behavior has interesting architectural possibilities and actually considerable structural advantages, it is hardly ever used in architecture because it lies outside of what we can design with our conventional techniques, including most digital ones. So in other words, one can actually say that as we as architects can simply not draw or model material behavior, we can usually not design with it. There are really only a very few examples of such elastically bent architectures, and may not come as a surprise that vernacular architecture, with its far more immediate relation to material behavior, has recognized their capacity. For example, and that's what you see in this image, the Madam people in southern Iraq used the elastic behavior of bundled reed to construct their houses. In addition to these sort of culturally evolved examples, there are a few technically or technologically derived bending active structures, such as, for example, the timber critchets that were developed by Fry Otto in the 1970s. And what is really interesting about these structures is that they are assembled as initially absolutely regular and planar lattice of wood members, and only once they're actually checked up at strategic points, as you can see here in the image on the left, they find the structurally stable double curve form by computing that sort of through on-site, through the elastic material behavior of the wood elements. So in many ways, our project aimed at further developing this sort of often overlooked lineage of bending active structures. And based on a discussion that we had with Fry Otto, we identified actually two main design research goals for doing this. First, the project aimed for integrating the skin and structure in one sort of monomaterial bending active system with no need for any additional cladding elements. And second, and this is in contrast to the aforementioned grid shells, we really wanted to investigate how we can use the elastic bending behavior not to generate sort of the overall form of the structure, but rather as a series of behavioral components that spatially mediate an intricate network of forces. So this project began with a series of physical tests of the bending deformation of these thin birch plywood strips and related computational simulations. And based on these tests, we were able to develop actually a fairly simple structure that employs the bending behavior in local segments rather than the overall arc. So this basic system, of which you can see a nice material simulation in this sequence, consists of planar strips that are subsequently connected and elastically bent so that the bend regions and the tensile regions that hold them in place alternate along their lengths. And the energy that you store in the system by bending it actually increases the structural capacity. So this is the basic behavioral system, and it was then transferred into a constructional system with the relatively simple aim to produce the entire structure with one machine and one tool only. And this was in our case, our fabrication robot, which we just got 2 weeks before we actually started to build this project. So in many ways, all the details are actually centered on the idea of building it with this machine only. So we had to develop a kind of tension puzzle joint to connect the strip segments, because we couldn't afford to buy 12-meter long plywood strips, only the regular stock size. And then obviously another critical morphological feature is the articulation of the strip outline, as this regulates the overall modulation of the transparency, the enclosure, and the exposure of the envelope, as well as the kind of natural lighting conditions inside, resulting from direct and indirect light, as well as the interaction of the structure with artificial light during night. The most critical detail, obviously, is the point where these strips are connected. And it's not difficult to detect that these connection points are actually local weak spots, because they have reduced effective structure depths. So where the strips cross, there is a kind of weak moment. However, we found a way to distribute these local weak spots so that they do not compromise the overall stability of the system. So as you can see nicely in this paper model here, this is actually achieved by letting the locations of the joints oscillate along the structure, resulting actually in quite a distinctive articulation of the envelope. So this distribution of the joint points that spatially mediates the material behavior of the plywood lamellas became one of the main drivers in the computational design process. And here, really, this is all about strategically introducing local irregularity that then allows global stability. And this was, again, corroborated with the kind of fully-fledged finite element analysis that actually simulates the bending of the initially planar strips and a subsequent coupling of the related segments. And then you can nicely see in this animation how the sort of pavilion finds the final shape of the structure as the equilibrium state of all interacting elastic elements. So one can actually say that the shape is really computed as the result of the material behavior. Obviously, the structurally required irregularity results in more than 500 geometrically different parts that could be still directly manufactured with our industrial robot. And then what is really interesting is that in contrast to the sort of substantial intellectual investment in developing the design computation and simulation process, the final system assembly is actually incredibly straightforward. The planar strips simply need to be connected, and then they find their specific shape entirely by themselves. So in other words, one can say that even in full scale on site, the material itself computes the shape of the pavilion. So the resulting pavilion's equilibrium state affords actually quite a unique architectural space, while at the same time being extremely efficient with the employed material resources. Actually, the combination of the pre-stress resulting from the elastic bending and this kind of morphological differentiation of the joint points allows using only extremely thin plywood strips. In fact, the entire structure, which had a diameter of more than 12 meters, can be actually constructed using plywood of only a thickness of 6.5 millimeters. So it's actually really super thin. And this super thin skin is at the same time load-bearing structure, which also needed to fulfill the stringent regulations of a German building application in regards to wind loads and snow loads. And it is also the light modulating and weather protecting envelope, which actually touched the ground topography on the street-facing corner of the site in order to define the sort of edge of the university campus. In contrast to that, the other side of this kind of torus-like construction is lifted up to form a kind of free-spanning entrance. Inside, the toroidal space can actually never be perceived in its entirety, which leads to a surprising spatial depth that was further enhanced by the sequence of direct and indirect illumination resulting from the convex and concave undulations of the underworld. So in addition to these explorations of the architectural possibilities, the construction of such a research project also allows a kind of more scientific validation of the presented computational design approach, which in this case was done by comparing 4 models. And the computational design model that you can see here on the top left, the material simulation, which is kind of finite element based, that you can see on the top right, the robot control model on the bottom left, and most importantly, a scan of the actual geometry of the constructed pavilion, which was actually done in collaboration with the Institute of Geodetic Engineering. So the constructed pavilion was actually repeatedly digitized using full-scale scanning equipment, which resulted in a huge point cloud, but from that we could actually extract the critical measure points and then overlay them with the computational design model, which actually showed that there are only very minor deviations. So really comparing the results of the generative computational design process, which you can see here in the upper half, with the exact measurements of the geometry that the material computed on site, indicates quite nicely that the suggested integration of material behavior in the computational design process is really not an idealized goal, but a feasible proposition. More importantly, I think the project also demonstrates how focusing the computational design process on material behavior rather than shape really allows for unfolding performative capacity and material sort of efficiency, while at the same time expanding the design space towards formerly unknown or unexplored architectural possibilities. So here, material is really not a passive receptor of shape, but an active generator of design. In addition to sort of these investigations of the design potential of materiality, we are also quite interested in further exploring the possibilities of materialization, which in architecture we usually call fabrication and production, which somehow leads us to the next chapter. And I think there's obviously no question that numerically controlled processes have already had a sort of major effect on architectural production. But most often, the use of digital fabrication is really of a facilitative rather than a generative nature. So we were wondering that if we really aim for overcoming this hierarchical conception of the generation of form and its materialization in architecture, how can we really systematically capture the specific affordances and constraints that are inherent in any digital fabrication environment so that they can become the point of departure for architectural inquiry. And in this context, it's actually very interesting to note that in architecture, we are very often fascinated by the sheer diversity of natural forms. However, in biology, there is actually a field of research that is called theoretical morphology that investigates why out of all the theoretically possible forms, only actually relatively few come to exist in nature. So in these studies, the concept of morphospaces, so-called morphospaces, is actually employed to describe not yet existing form. In the early 1960s, the paleontologist David Raup published quite a seminal paper in Science, which was entitled Theoretical Morphology of Coiled Shells, in which he presented a series of computer-generated shell forms. It's quite amazing to see that, because this is long before architects got their hand on computers. It's around the same time when they started to develop Sketchpad at the MIT, which turned out to become the first sort of CAD software. More interestingly, he then went on to use a kind of three-dimensional coordinate system to map out the parameters of the form generation process. So what you can see on the left is basically all the forms that he computed, and then he sort of mapped the parameters, the variables of these forms, into so-called theoretical morphospace, which is the white space on the left, and he found out that within this space of all possible forms, only very few actually exist in nature. And that is then the empirical morphospace, which is highlighted in gray here. So out of his 25 identified possible morphologies, only about a dozen actually do exist. So what we are interested in is sort of investigating how we can transfer this concept from theoretical morphology to design computation, so that at the very onset of the design process, the space of the physically producible can actually be identified and architecturally explored. And that's something I will show on this project, which is again one of our research pavilions, which was again a kind of collaborative undertaking of my institute, the Institute of Jan Knippers, and other members of our German biomedics competence network, which includes experts from biology and biomechanics. In contrast to the other project I just showed, this project really began with an investigation how digital production processes allow for an extension of relatively traditional wood jointing techniques. Here, the system that we developed is really derived from two technological innovations. On the one hand, a special tool that was custom made for us by one of the project's industrial partners, which allows for simultaneously cutting at the tip and the edge of this tool, and obviously the use of an industrial robot. So in combination, these two things enable the development of robotically fabricated finger joints that you can see here on the left, that make it possible to join blades at various different angles and even with different thicknesses, resulting in relatively complex spatial blade structures of multiple blades connected at diverse angles. But they are still maintaining somehow the underlying advantage of traditional finger joints, which means that they don't require any additional mechanical or adhesive connections. So based on the very specific robot setup, which in this case is a 7-axis setup, which includes an additional turntable, we then identified three critical morphological parameters of these finger joint wood plates. The first one is the connection angle that defines the angle between the adjacent blades, the polygon angle that somehow expresses the shape of the plate, and the polygon radius that captures the size of the plate. And then by using a specific sort of robot fabrication simulation software, the min-max ranges of these morphological parameters could be established and mapped into what we have termed the machinic morphospace, which is defined by coordinate axes that actually represent these morphological parameters. So within the theoretical morphospace of all geometrically possible plate morphologies, which you can see here on the bottom left, we can now sort of map the machinic morphospace that emerges through the kind of constraints, the machinic constraints of, for example, a 6-axis robot setup as in the middle, or a 7-axis robot setup as on the right. Now that obviously begs the question how one can actually navigate this space of the physically producible to explore it computationally, and especially focusing on its interesting and performative regions. And here it's interesting to note that the biomedical engineer Julian Winston once stated that in biology, material is actually expensive, but shape is cheap. And as of today, the opposite was actually true in the case of technology. And I would say that arguably this situation is about to change with a shift from serial to digital production. So one interesting aspect in mapping the affordances and constraints of materialization into a machine morphospace is that it opens up the possibility to actually employ biomimetic design strategies to explore particularly promising regions within that space, which then allows for unfolding performative capacity from morphological differentiation rather than surplus material. In order to do so, one obviously has to understand the very particular structural behavior of finger joints, and it's not difficult to understand that these joints are very good in transferring shear forces along the edges. So if you imagine you want to move one blade against the other like this, these connections are very good. If you have bending moments or tensile forces, they're actually very bad, or not very performative, so to say, which poses quite a considerable challenge if you want to build larger blade structures. However, and that's the interesting thing, is that there are natural systems that have evolved ways of successfully addressing exactly this challenge. For example, the sand dollar, which belongs to the class of echinoidea, has a blade skeleton that consists of discrete polygonal blades. So you may actually know these sand dollars. It's basically a kind of sea urchin, and you find them on the beach, you can actually dismantle them into the individual blades. What is really fascinating is that these blades are actually connected by so-called stereo projections that are very similar to finger joints, and that the sand dollar has actually developed very specific morphologies that really fully capitalize on these joint structural behavior. Basically, by evolving shell structures that transfer all the forces that are acting on them into normal and shear forces along the blade edges. And by that, they almost entirely avoid kind of tensile and bending moments. So with the help of the biologists with which we collaborated, we identified actually 8 relevant biomimetic design principles that govern this performative capacity and captured them in algorithmic rules that were then embedded in a computational design process. And this process still allows for quite a high degree of spatial modulation. For example, through topological transformations of infolding and splitting, while at the same time ensuring consistency with the complex reciprocities between the producible on the one hand and the performative on the other, which were then iteratively tested and calibrated. So the resultant computational process really enables the designer to explore the machine morphospace of the physically producible through the filter of the biomimetic design rules, which in concert with spatial and contextual criteria really lead to a highly specific blade morphology. And this kind of articulation of the envelope results in high structural performance and quite a distinctive architectural character, which both stem from the morphological differentiation of the blade system. On the other hand, this differentiation obviously requires the fabrication of, in this case, more than 850 different blades with more than 100,000 of these finger joints, of which you can actually see a spatial mapping of the robot control path in this image. But somehow, as the logics of materialization were actually the driver of this design process, the necessary topological sorting of all these elements and the generation of the required fabrication data forms an integral part of the custom computation process, so that the robot control code could be fully automatically generated from the design files, despite the inherent complexity of working actually with a 7-axis setup, which means that you are in the domain of no kind of standard software. So for these kind of applications, you have to write the robot control code entirely yourself. So here you can nicely see how such a blade is actually manufactured. Initially, it is mounted on a turntable, trimmed by the robot. That's the part that was skipped in this video. And then the finger joints are cut in one go, highly precise, with the robot. One plate takes about 3 to 4 minutes. So again, in contrast to the considerable complexity of the design process and the research that went into that, and I should mention that all these projects are actually conducted by a team of usually 10 students and 5 to 6 PhD researchers that work together on these kind of prototypes. Here, sort of this intense investigation or research leads to a very straightforward and simple construction system. Basically, you end up with a huge puzzle of finger joint plates that are assembled into individual modules without the need for any special tools or heavy technical equipment. And although all the individual plates are extremely thin, the modules demonstrate then a considerable structural capacity while remaining to be lightweight. So despite the vast range of individual plate morphologies, the assembly of the modules is somehow self-correcting, so to such a degree that we were quite confident to build up the structure sort of from the bottom up, which left very limited possibilities for tolerance compensation. Nevertheless, and despite the fact that we had no time to build actually any prototype or mock-up, so that the first plate we actually produced with the robot was used in the actual structure, the construction went reasonably well, with only minor tolerances between the modules and comparatively small deviations between the structure as planned and as built, which was again sort of checked by a comprehensive laser scan of the entire system, which you can see here. You can also see nicely on the upper image the resolution of these 3D scans, which is almost like a kind of 3D photograph. The resulting lightweight modular wood shell demonstrates both the structural capacity and the architectural potential of a system that exclusively consists of extremely thin birch-blind plates that are connected only by these robotically fabricated finger joints. So based on the systematic exploration of the machine morphospace of this kind of the system reveals the spatial capacity to overcome the kind of usually quite hermetic character of shared structures. For example, enabling the system to come back onto itself creates an oculus that visually connects the interior with the surrounding park, resulting basically in two kinds of spaces. A truly internal space that is characterized by the perforation of the inner skin that is actually required to assemble the prefabricated modules, which was also used for a sort of indirect LED illumination that actually gradually decreases towards the point where this double-layered system bifurcates to open up an interstitial space between the inner and the outer layer where no perforation is any longer required, and the construction logics of this system becomes somehow obvious. As the structural performance here really results from each element's highly specific morphological response to the acting forces, the entire pavilion, with again a diameter of more than 12 meters, could be built using exclusively extremely thin plates. Actually, all the plates within the structure, without any exception, have only a thickness of again 6.5 millimeters, which results in a very lightweight and materially efficient structure that actually manages to enclose 200 cubic meters of space by using only 2 cubic meters of wood, which is a ratio of roughly 1 to 100. As a non-programmed semi-interior urban space, the pavilion provided actually quite a popular meeting point and lunch location, as well as for other sort of more informal, spontaneous urban uses as a kind of architectural playground for both children and adults, students I should probably say. So I think overall the project shows quite nicely again how embedding the logics of materialization in a morphogenetic computation process enables the designer to really offset the conventional economies of construction. Here, a substantial investment is made intellectually in the design process which then results in a surprisingly simple system that still yields novel architectural possibilities, while at the same time offering a high level of material efficiency and performative capacity. What is also interesting to note is that the morphology of the cent dollar is actually quite an exceptional one, because most natural systems are actually not built up from individual elements, which is somehow the logic of construction in the building sector, but rather they're built as continuous structures where you can actually not differentiate one part from the other. So, in many ways, this was the focus of the third part of our research that I would like to introduce along another example of a research pavilion. Although this project is not fully finished yet, this project will actually be finished at the beginning of next week. This was again a kind of collaborative undertaking of Jan Knippers and my institute, but this time also involved biologists from the Department of Evolutionary Biology and Paleontology at the University of Tübingen and composite engineers from the Institute of Textile Technology and Process Engineering. So, as mentioned, different to the previous pavilions, especially to the one that I just showed, which was really built up as a shell from differentiated yet discrete elements. In this project, we were really interested in the opposite approach of a kind of entirely continuous shell in which the material structure itself is constructed and differentiated through robotic fabrication. An interesting natural example of such a structure is the exoskeleton of the American lobster. And at first glance, this exoskeletons cuticula, that's the way it's called, appears as a kind of fairly monolithic shell, but under the microscope it again reveals a highly differentiated structure that is organized across several levels of hierarchy. And although everything is essentially one material, the build-up and the orientation of the chitin fibers allows the microstructure to very specifically respond to local requirements, resulting in considerably different material behavior within different regions of this exoskeleton. So you can nicely see that in this kind of trivial mechanical or mapping of the stress-strain behavior, which shows a comparison between the crusher claw, the pincher claw, and the connective membranes. And you can see that essentially one material is differentiated to have very, very different behaviors in different parts of the kind of exoskeleton. So in collaboration with the biologists, the students and the researchers actually carefully investigated the different parts of this lobster shell, which they studied under the microscope to identify different fiber organizations, such as, for example, the strong parallel fiber arrangements here, or the more helicoidal fiber structures in this image, as well as the more complex situations of cuticular morphology and related fiber layers. Because somehow these logics of the chitin fibers and the kind of protein matrix somehow resemble the logics of synthetic composites, we began at the same time to investigate new manufacturing technologies for glass or carbon fiber composites, such as North Thales 3D technology. That's not actually really new. It's almost 10 years old. But it's kind of a process where all the fibers actually individually laid on one huge mold. So different to these kind of fiber layout systems, which we actually discussed with Bill Pearson, who's the technical director of North Thales, we decided that on an architectural scale, you cannot work with 100% contact mold, because that means you have to build your building as a mold before you actually build it as a composite structure. So what we try to do is to develop a process of what one may actually call robotic filament winding, in which the process is actually based on a minimal linear framework, which we also tested and refined through a series of small-scale mock-ups, as you can see in the video. So really, the kind of mold is reduced to these kind of elements, and then the actual surfaces are built up as a kind of in the process of filament binding on that framework. So now having established the basic sort of robot programming logics, which again are not trivial in this case, and result material structure through these experiments, we went on to do a series of mechanical tests in order to understand the behavior of the resultant fiber structures. Because again, the way that these things behave is highly dependent on how they're made. So you cannot sort of just go and check out a textbook in order to find or understand the material properties. So based on these investigations and on the biological principles, this was then related to regions of different fiber organizations within the overall logic of the robotic filament binding morphology, of which you can see here actually a physical model indicating the glass fiber regions in white and carbon fiber in black. Such as, for example, the regions of unidirectional carbon fiber arrangements at the support points that you can see here, and the more helicoidal glass fiber organization on the shell's closed sides, which was again intricately checked through structural simulations. Based on this, an entire syntax for the fiber placement was developed to articulate actually different architectural situations, such as an entrance location that you can see here, or a roof morphology that you can see here. And this resulted in a kind of comprehensive method for developing a related design technique that unfolds quite a rich repertoire of possible architectural morphologies, while at the same time remaining absolutely coherent with the logical constraints of the robotic filament binding process. So the robot control code for this quite complex process, because the robot moves in a different way than the actual fibers are sort of forming in the end, was developed such that it directly interacts with the design environment. Yet again, as the resultant interrelation between the geometry, the fiber layout, and the resultant fiber organization, as well as the resultant structural behavior, is fairly complex, this was intuitively analyzed and ultimately also optimized in collaboration with the engineers from the ITKE during the design process in order to achieve a sort of minimal sort of thickness of the shell with a given amount of fibers that we wanted to use. So compared to the previous two pavilions presented before, that could actually be produced within the somewhat cozy environment of our lab, this project really required a far more involving fabrication setup on site, where the pavilion is produced on a temporary scaffold that is mounted on a robot-controlled turntable. So in this case, we first had to build a pretty large tent, because these materials still need to be applied in a somewhat controlled environment. And then we needed to get a much bigger robot, actually one that you see here has a kind of 4 meter long arm. And then we had to quite precisely fabricate the temporary steel scaffolding that will obviously be taken out at the end of the fabrication process. So after this temporary scaffold was completed, we used the robot to scan the individual locations of the notches on the framework. And then one late night in August, this frame started to spin, and we were able to lay the first glass fiber rollings, as you can nicely see in this video. Obviously, the idea, or not the idea, but this is actually a try run where the fibers are laid without the resin, but ultimately, and I'll show you a video of that in a second, the fibers run through resin bars before they're actually laid on the structure, so it's really constructed in a wet state. So through this basically fully automated process, the shell is then built up of successive layers of this glass and carbon fiber winding. And I think this video shows quite nicely also how the fibrous layers actually begin to interact within the construction process. For example, here you see nicely how the carbon fiber actually forms these quite complex, curved situations because the sort of glass fiber is basically forming a double curved surface on which they are laid. So, and as I mentioned before, as you can see in this video, the fibers are actually laid wet, which means that they are running through this kind of resin bath before they're laid on the framework. And then the resin-saturated structure slowly dries in the build-up process, ensuring that the resulting sort of system is really continuous. It's nice to see that from the point of view of the robot, which you actually never really see, because the camera that we have on top of the whole thing was actually stolen. So as I mentioned, the production is not completed yet. I have another, actually 5 layers of carbon glass fiber will be added to what you actually see in this photograph, which will ultimately result in almost a closed surface, which will be actually fully closed in particular regions of it. I think we're definitely facing a couple of interesting challenges still, especially, for example, when taking out that temporary framework. But the kind of preliminary results that we have achieved and the related precision of the fiber layer, both in regards to the fiber interaction in the winding process and the local fiber articulation, as well as the kind of regional structures that we were able to achieve, is fairly encouraging. So here you see actually a snapshot of the current state of the winding process. Actually, that's last week, and as I mentioned, it should be actually finished at the beginning of this week, and we'll publish it on our website and Facebook site. The final shell will then actually consist of more than 30 kilometers of robotically laid fibers, both carbon fiber and glass fiber, but it will be only approximately 4 millimeters thick. And obviously it will be very lightweight. So in a way, synthesizing the capability of the machine with building up the material structure itself, the transparent glass fiber surfaces and the black carbon fiber row rings that are actually the structural material will allow perceiving the logic of the differentiated fibrous organization within the translucent envelope, all basically forming one continuously constructed materiality. So after having introduced the design potentials inherent in designing and constructing a kind of synthetic materiality, I will return once more and sort of for the last project that I will show to wood as a kind of natural composite structure. In order to show how such a kind of materially informed approach to design computation allows actually exploring the performative capacity that is latent even in such simple and everyday materials as wood. Over the last 5 years, we have actually conducted an entire series of projects in which we investigated how we can actually tap into the inherent environmental responsiveness of wood, which is one of the most common and cheapest construction materials we have. And what is really interesting about wood is that it's a hygroscopic material, which means it maintains its moisture content in equilibrium with the surrounding relative humidity. So the related processes of actually adsorbing and desorbing water molecules affects the microfibrillar structure, resulting in both a change of strength and a change of dimension, which is actually a differential change. Usually, we experience this so-called dimensional instability of wood as a deficiency of the material that results in jammed drawers or wobbly parquet floors. And in fact, we invest more than 70% of the energy in wood processing to somehow suppress that inherent behavior. So you can nicely see here how 70% of the wood processing energy are spent on kiln drying which is an attempt to reduce the moisture contents to less than 10%, and hope that induces a level of dimensional stability in the wood. So in this project, we were kind of interested in doing somewhat exactly the opposite by exploring the climate-responsive capacity of wood. I think in that sense it's important to understand that typically climate responsiveness in architecture is really conceived as a technical function enabled by myriad mechanical and electronic devices. And in contrast to this superimposition of high-tech equipment on what otherwise is a relatively inert and dumb material, our approach tried to investigate a fundamentally different kind of no-tech strategy. Here, the climate responsiveness is really quite literally ingrained in the material itself. And a very interesting natural example of such a responsive structure is the spruce cone, which, as you probably know, grows in a kind of moist, closed state on the tree. Then, and by that time it's already a dead organ, it falls off the tree, and once the kind of ground or environment that it ended up in has reached suitably dry conditions, the cone opens up completely by itself and the seeds are released. And this opening happens due to the differential shrinkage of the fiber structure during the reduction in moisture content. So based on this principle of transferring kind of dimensional change into a shape change, we developed a humidity sensitive composite element in which the wood veneer is actually the reactive layer. So this video shows quite nicely how changes in relative humidity, as you can see on the hygrometer reading here at the bottom, leads to an autonomous shape change of the element that is really only triggered by the dimensional changes of the veneer. And we have tested the reliability of this movement by now over many cycles, actually hundreds of cycles, but as this is a kind of material inherent behavior, one can actually not see any fatigue. So we have also conducted a series of further tests where we developed actually ways of physically programming the responsive material of the wood during the production process. So using exactly the same material to start off with, you can actually now achieve sort of different responses given exactly the same change in humidity. So for example, and that's something you can nicely see in this video, when the relative humidity rises from just 50 to 70%, the initially closed elements you can see here on the right will open, while the ones on the left will actually close. So exposed to exactly the same environmental changes and constructed out of exactly the same material, we can still program these pieces to respond in exactly the opposite way. This behavior has been tested in a number of full-scale functional mock-ups and has been also verified in terms of coherency and reliability of the movement in both laboratory tests and long-term tests in outdoor conditions, which by now we have conducted for more than 18 months on the roof of our university building. So monitoring the system and the environmental conditions every 15 minutes for the last 1.5 years, we can say that the system performs actually faultlessly. Every time rain approaches and the humidity level automatically rises, the system reliably kind of closes, and it has done so by now for many, many hundreds of cycles. So at the same time, and accounting for the quite complex reciprocity of individual element as well as overall system responsiveness, we have developed a more adaptive system and the kind of related computational design process in order to derive a more specific system morphology. So in this process, the surface geometry is algorithmically generated and controlled through a number of parameters that are based on the material's anatomy, characteristics and behavior, resulting actually in a fully functional prototype. So here you can see the veneer composite pieces are reacting to changes in relative humidity completely by themselves, actually being at the same time sensor, motor and regulating element. So given a change in relative humidity, the system really opens and closes with no need for any supply of external energy or any kind of mechanical or electronic control. Here the responsiveness is quite literally ingrained in the material itself. So currently, we're trying to convince the city of Frankfurt that they need a pavilion with this structure, which on rainy days with relatively high ambient humidity would be a fully closed envelope. But when the weather changes and the sun comes out, the related decrease, related sort of ambient humidity would automatically trigger the structure to open. Obviously, beyond just fulfilling the merely functional requirements of such a sort of convertible building roof, this autonomous passive actuation of the surface would provide quite a unique experience of environmental and spatial qualities. We're still waiting for this project to happen, but in the meantime, we had the chance to develop the system further based on the commission by the Centre Pompidou in Paris for an installation for their permanent collection, which was actually named Hygroscope Material-Sensitive Morphology. So in many ways, the Centre Pompidou embodies somewhat the architectural opposite to our approach. In fact, one can say that the building celebrates the very technology that maintains the stable interior climate as one of its key architectural features. Thus, our concept for this commission was to insert into the space of the Centre Pompidou, which arguably is one of the most climatically stable interiors in the world, a virtual extension of the exterior climate in the form of a large display case in which we reproduce the dynamics of the external environment. So situated within this glass case, the movement of this material-sensitive morphology allows experiencing the subtle humidity fluctuations that actually form part of our everyday life, but usually escape completely our spatial perception. In this case, the specific system morphology is again computationally derived based on the system-intrinsic material variables and the system-extrinsic environmental conditions, which were simulated by one of the project partners for this project, which are the climate engineers Transolar. So here you can see that even within a very controlled environment such as this glass case, the relative humidity distributes in a very heterogeneous fashion. And this heterogeneity formed the input for the computation process, which resulted in a very differentiated morphology, articulating actually 3 different concentration points that respond to changes in humidity with a different kind of movement in these different regions. As it happens, we also had to build this entire installation in-house, which again entailed fairly elaborate robotic fabrication for the substructure, as well as the production of the more than 800 responsive linear composite elements. So we also do this in-house. But as this process is actually extremely moisture sensitive, we had to monitor and control the relative humidity during this and during the entire assembly process. As we could simply not find a company that was willing to do the job for us, we also had the interesting task to build the kind of climate control unit for this installation. So here you can see this climate control unit, which is a kind of mini Centre Pompidou underneath the display case that undoes what the big Centre Pompidou does in terms of climatic conditioning. It also required some intense nights of fine-tuning the code and the technical equipment. The final installation explores a novel mode of responsive architecture through unfolding material inherent capacities. Here, the material continuously recomputes form and performance in feedback with the environment. So within the glass case, the climate actually corresponds to an accelerated database of the relative humidity levels outside Paris. Thus, the case sort of functions less as a separation from the interior space of the Centre Pompidou, but rather as a kind of virtual connection to the outside environment. The perception of the ever-changing and locally varied environmental dynamics is intensified through the silent movement of this responsive morphology. And in this way, the installation provides a visual experience of the subtle variations in humidity levels that we hardly ever consciously perceive. So suspended within the humidity controlled glass case, the system responds to climatic fluctuations of outside Paris, and a mere increase in relative humidity triggers the system to change its surface porosity to kind of breathe and ventilate the moisture-saturated air. So the very simple wood morphology really embodies the capacity to sense, actuate, and respond, being constructed from simple veneer elements only, without the need for any additional mechanical or electronic equipment, or even the supply of any external energy. So I think one can really say that here, the material itself is the machine. Given this, I would just say one needs to be a little bit patient and not expect every one of these sort of innovations, technological innovations, to turn into sort of skyscrapers within sort of one decade. Any other questions? now it depends whether you call that a kind of ultimate vision or a relatively naive vision. But I think what I mean is that, and that's maybe a little bit sort of polemically put, it's quite interesting, you know, that we have this building material wood around for as long as we actually construct things. And yet, and it's really not the kind of sort of exotic way that we treat these materials, or any kind of exotic material that we put onto them. It's actually regular materials that you can just buy off the shelf everywhere. It's just the way that it's put together and an understanding of the anatomy of wood that allows one to actually achieve relatively surprising things with it, to the point that you can actually program it to respond very differently to a given input. So I think it's this material response that we can program. I doubt that it will come to the point that we just sort of program materials and then they start to sort of self-assembly or whatever. Although there's a lot of research actually going on into this field of the self-assembly of materials, the way you can sort of use physical computing to sort of construct larger structures, which is actually equivalent to the way that the DNA actually unravels the entire life as building blocks. But I think, obviously, what is important to understand is that, and that's the only thing I wanted to actually communicate, is that the designer plays a crucial role in this process, and it's not replaced by doing that. I think all this is genuinely sort of design research that has an explorative nature. It's not sort of just sort of technical nature.
How much are you interested in failure in the process? It's the way you explained it, obviously, in such a beautiful way. It looks like a seamless process of design, where things seem almost not to go wrong. But I guess there are lots of sort of issues where it doesn't work, where the joints are not the right ones and have to be redone and so on. How much is it part of the creative process, and actually how much advantage do you take of these moments where it doesn't work according to the plan?
Well, I mean, ultimately, all this is driven by failure, because that's the way that these things develop. So it's a constant sort of posing a hypothesis of how one thing could be done, then experiencing that what is actually physically taking place is something different, and then going back and sort of changing the system accordingly. Now, one advantage of always starting with the physical rather than the computational is that there is a kind of inherent, let's say, robustness in the initial hypothesis that is posed. So I think that is really kind of, I think that's one of the crucial characteristics of this kind of research, that we always start with the material investigations, and then it's kind of oscillation between the material and the computational, and that is driven by error, as all developments are ultimately driven by kind of experiencing the limits of a system and then tuning it to overcome them. Obviously, in a presentation like that, it would be a bit elaborate to introduce all the problems, because then it would be a 5-hour lecture.
Related to that question, maybe it seems to me that in most, I mean, at least these coherent projects, there seems to be almost two main elements. One is geometry and sophistication with geometry, so it's kind of more virtual element, computational one. And the other one is working with material. And at least for me, and it's maybe more common than a question, but I would like to hear your comment as well on that. For instance, this pavilion where the wood is, or material is really working, and there is lots of change, and material is actually breaking, to me, is hugely more successful than the one that is actually the next one that was produced after that, where actually it almost seems material is confined to very interesting geometry and an interesting kind of study from the biomagnetic territory, but it's still, it's not really necessarily working so much with that sort of
I think that, yeah, that depends on your criteria of evaluation. I mean, the interesting thing is that here, in this case, this is the first pavilion I showed, it becomes probably more obvious and visible and tangible that the material is actually in a state in which we usually experience it only as a failure mode, which is this sort of excessive bending. elastic bending. So here one can actually see the forces embedded into the pavilion and the kind of working with the elastic behavior. In the other pavilions, actually, that you work a lot more with the structural behavior, but it's on the level that you can actually not see. That's also why it turns out that the other systems actually, if you just sort of go down the road of quantitative assessment, which is obviously not the only way of doing this, is actually a more efficient structural system. Because by actually really taking maximum advantage of these particular joints, which are geometrically driven primarily, you get an even better ratio of sort of enclosing space with a given material. I think as a kind of architectural venture, I think these are actually individual aspects, and I think that this project really investigates the material behavior, and somehow that's also what I try to, sort of, the way I try to introduce it. The other one really looks more at what the possibilities of these machines are, which ultimately are sort of geometrically driven. What is still missing is sort of synthesizing these things, these four aspects that I've introduced into kind of one comprehensive process.
But maybe related to that, I mean, in this example, for instance, it seemed to me, at least that's the impression that when I look at the process, that the management or micromanagement of construction was quite more elegant or easier. The other one seems to be so, because for instance, it's okay on the scale of the pavilion, but if we imagine something really massive in terms of many more cells, and if you have to put every cell on its specific position, it might become a kind of construction management.
Funnily enough,
very expensive, let's say, operation. I'm just trying to.
Funny enough, we have actually a research application running right now, which will actually take the second system and turn it from a temporary building to a kind of more permanent building construction. And it's basically the opposite of what you just said, Alisa, but the kind of construction industry sees that as the most viable system to be turned into actually a construction system. Because it's stable, it doesn't actually, it actually uses structural behavior that is more known than the one that you see here. And ultimately the assembly, which was a bit elaborate, can be also automized. It's just that here we just automized the fabrication of the individual elements, and assembly was basically man-made. But the last part could possibly be automized. So maybe it's also that the kind of shell building is more conventional than this one, and that's why this may be actually the first one for which we get a chance to sort of build it as a actually larger and more permanent building. Also with a kind of fully enclosed space that then comes with all the kind of additional challenges of insulation, acoustics, and all these things.
Your project seems to kind of be consistently quite beautiful and theatrical and surprising. And I wonder how much of that is within your brief when you start with it, or how much you think is a kind of byproduct of your will for mastering performance of the material.
Well, I think the narrative of the presentation does not necessarily absolutely sort of overlap with the way these things are done. And obviously I choose these 4 projects because I think they illustrate quite successfully the particular points I try to make in regard to these 4 themes that I try to introduce. We've done a lot more of these experiments and construction projects, and I think these, the ones that I showed, just sort of fall into an interesting sequence. I think one thing that you mentioned is really important is that at one point, what initially seems to be a fairly sort of technologically driven venture comes to the point where it unfolds other qualities that I don't talk about in the presentation, but that you actually sort of perceive while watching the presentation. And I think this is usually the indicator that these projects are successful on many layers. And that's why I sort of choose to show these. which doesn't mean that the other projects are not interesting, pleasing or anything, but I think what I'm trying to say is actually that I wouldn't call it beauty, but there's a certain elegance about some of these projects that comes out as a byproduct of a very rigorous and systematic design research. And I think that ultimately also renders it successful.
Thanks. Thanks for the presentation. It was really inspiring. I'm wondering how you work with the idea of replication of these pavilions, because all the way of making them by robotic hands and so on have the possibility to replicate them as many times you want. In difference, all the contrary with, handmade structures. So, how you deal with that?
I mean, all these systems, and that's why we call them systems, are ultimately rather construction systems that have been tested along one particular prototype, which we call the pavilion, which is usually a demonstrator of the system's capacities and is specifically designed to sort of investigate the limits of this construction process. That's the way that this second pavilion's shape came about. Basically, it's trying to see whether it can form synclastic, anticlastic surfaces, whether it can actually have what the kind of spans are that it can achieve, and so on and so on. So I think there is a certain systemic understanding of these prototypes, and I think all of them would sort of be capable of being further developed into construction systems, which then could sort of find their way into different sort of architectural contexts. But I think our main interest is in exploring the possibilities inherent to them, and then maybe also going the way to sort of see how they can be actually transferred into a more permanent kind of building, but it's not sort of refining it to the point where it's a market-ready product that could be replicated again and again. So we are not just sort of interested in the technological aspect, we're also interested in the architectural inquiry. Just so
I have been most of the projects you showed, they all seem to be surface-based, so to me it's very interesting set of experiments, and I was wondering when you research you go into more spatial research, like intelligent, more intelligent.
you have to elaborate on that question. That's something I really don't get.
Most of the videos I've seen, they're very interesting as a surface project, it's very much to be surface-based, where there is, I'm thinking that it's research to become more three-dimensional. Because let's say the shape here, locally or on the surface, you can see it, but I'm wondering whether you should do something else three-dimensional, spatially.
I've sort of repeated that because, I've asked you to repeat it because I think that's a bit of kind of, I would almost say, a stereotypical question. Because in the end, this is the last thing that I would call a surface system. Because it is a cumulative network of forces that are actually mediating spatially the elastic behavior of the climate system. I think only if you were to perceive it on the very superficial level, I would still call that a surface project. Because the history of surface projects is really coming from very, very, very different sort of both technological point of view and from conceptual point of view. So I would really struggle to understand these projects as essentially surface projects. And if I understand your question differently, and I hope that was the intention, that you sort of ask for more complex spatial arrangements.
Maybe the scale of the issue, maybe the scale of the component, maybe at this stage, to me, I mean, it's very intensively surface project, but I don't see how spatially, I mean, I don't see it. Very intensively surface system, but I don't see more.
Well, I think it's just sort of, for me, it's kind of a cliche response to these kind of projects, which I tried to sort of undo in the last 1 hour. If it was not clear enough, I have to apologize for that.
maybe is in the materials, all the examples you've used come from kind of planar or tensile formations of materials. So perhaps what would your approach be for looking at something which is more like a sonic or like a compressive material, something which is very solid? I think that would have a very different outcome.
Well, that's a very interesting question. And I think that's maybe something that relates to that. I think the more vast variety of building materials we have are either viscous or sheets. So we've tried the viscous actually with these granular substances that I only showed in 3 or 4 images. I think there's a kind of, I would say, a kind of inherent ambition in these projects that sort of relates also to something that you may call lightweight structures. So in that sense, it's always a little bit about minimizing the build volume, which ultimately leads to tensile systems or basically things in the constructive machine materials. So I think that's sort of the history and maybe also just the personal kind of interest in these kind of undertakings. Ultimately, it's very interesting that, for example, these wood systems have caught a lot of attention by, for example, the German Ministry of Forestry, because they are so lightweight and they are not material intensive. Because, as you may know, in Europe, these kind of solid timber constructions are very kind of prominent right now, and they already know that if they consume, which was one of the promotion factors, because every piece of wood that you have in there is actually basically CO2 packaged in a nice sort of building. But they already know that if they want to maintain that level of production with solid timber wall constructions, they're going to run out of sustainably forested wood. So they're very interested in reducing the kind of solidity or amount of material. They're very interested in investigating possibilities of using sheet materials as opposed to, for example, cross-laminated timber construction, ultimately solid wood construction. Good. Thank you.